Yes, I'm Barney Phillips. Those of you who know me from before 1965, when I was christened Barney at a working bee at St John's School by Bern Manning, I think actually, or it might have been Peter Manning. My name is Bernard Phillips actually, so my parents called me Bernard for 50-something years, and so some people will know me as Bernard and some as Barney. Anyway, that's me. So I'm here tonight to talk a little bit about fire, and my talk tonight is a pretty general one. It might be an early night, might be a late night, depends how much arguments I get about what I remember as a 12-year-old. I've already had a few discussions with a few people, and there are a number of people here who are older than me, more actively involved in the fire in 1967, and I will talk a fair bit about that. Not just about Richmond, but the fire generally. This particular image behind me was taken only a few weeks ago at Colebrook. So looking forward, I do look forward a little bit. It's not a great detailed presentation of looking forward, so I can talk generally. But we're in for everyone knows that we've got a fairly dry spell at the moment and have had a lot of growth in previous years. So it's not unlike coming into 1967. So basically my talk tonight, it's a little bit personal intro, which Alan's already mentioned some of that. A few fires in Tasmania generally, Black Tuesday, some more recent fires around the Richmond area, and the fire season for 2023-2024. So this is a Saturday evening Mercury from 28th of October 1965. I think Lou will remember it pretty well. There's a few people here who helped us a great deal after our house burnt down at Dolcott. Total lost everything except what we were wearing on the day. And the fire was serviced by the Richmond Fire Brigade with the Blitz truck, but arrived a little bit late, so the fire was well and truly taken over the house by the time the fire brigade got there. And so my personal history, I certainly understand the impact of fire, as no doubt a few others do here in the room as well. In Tasmania, fires have been part of the landscape to the extent the Aboriginal people use fire for hunting. They also carried their fires from campsite to campsite, so no doubt they dropped it a bit on the way, and fires started accidentally as well as deliberately in that situation. And the Tasmanian bush is to a great extent influenced by fire, particularly eucalypt and dry sclerophyll forests, and where a lot of the farmland is, fires were very common throughout the period before white settlement. And since 1804, when we did settle, there were a lot of fires, big fires recorded in 1850s, 1898, 1914, 1927, 1934 and then 1967. And then more recently, significant fire was Dun Alley, but there's been a few others as well. This is a bit technical, and I won't necessarily read out every number, but those of you who are experienced in understanding the relative parameters that make a really bad day, a catastrophic day, these are all catastrophic days by today's classification. So it goes back, this is data that came out of a report on the 1967 bushfire. So it was looking backwards 70 years, and they saw that there were 6 significant catastrophic days in that 70-year period. And the author of the report was a guy who worked for forestry, and he studied it at the time, and he considered about a 13-year cycle, but of course these things don't always go to plan. I suppose with global warming we might consider that it might be more frequent now, but since 1967 we've had a couple of significant events and there's been some big fires on eastern seaboard of Australia. But the 13 years was interesting. There was a fire at Richmond on 7th of February 1993, which was like two 13-year cycles after 1967. And so looking at these, the information that's here is saying that the maximum temperature was all 37, 38, 39 degrees. The humidities varied from 7% through to about, discounting 1897 was 22%, but the humidities were down around the 10% mark, 10, 11, 12%. So those who understand that what makes a fire conditions pretty bad, a high temperature, a low humidity, and quite a significant wind. On Black Tuesday, the maximum wind gust recorded was 122 kilometres an hour with 39 degrees and 11% humidity. So no wonder it was a bad day. It was going to be a bad day, and some of the earlier fires was more luck than good management that there wasn't the same sort of loss of life. It's just some of those earlier fires passed Hobart by 20 kilometres to the west. They were the back of Mount Wellington, not the front of Mount Wellington. So it just depends which way the fire goes and how it impacts people. In 1967, on the day itself, I'll talk a little bit about wind shift in a minute, but the way the fire goes, it could have trapped 200 or 300 people at Ferntree, but the wind changed just at a critical time. And that wind change then killed some people at Oyster Cove and killed people where fires joined up. So it was quite a... the point of this slide is to say that the blow-up days, as I referred to them at the time, or the catastrophic days, were not entirely rare. They do happen, and therefore it is a matter of trying to be aware of that situation. The fire brigade's a lot more communicative now than it was in 1967. The fire brigade is quite extensively communicating facts and figures, and there's a TAS alert website and app and so on. So it shouldn't be as bad as 1967 again. We've had the Dunalley fire and there was no loss of life in that quite significant fire. So there's just to be aware that the climate is out there and does repeat itself. Whether it's 13 years or 3 years, it doesn't really matter, it's going to happen again. On the particular day of 1967, I'm drifting into the 7th of February event now. I was a 12-year-old, so my memory was quite limited and focused on going to school, first day of school, and we have half day the first day of school, we come home at lunchtime. And so the conditions of the day probably didn't worry me on my way to school. It was 23 degrees at 6 o'clock in the morning. It was actually 32 degrees by 9 o'clock, so it did heat up relatively quickly. And it wasn't windy in the early morning, and the humidity was at 43% in the very early morning. But by 10 o'clock, it was 34 degrees and 18% humidity, and the wind had started. And by mid-afternoon, it was chaos because the temperature had got to 39.2 at 1 o'clock. It was 12% humidity, and the wind was already 44 kilometres an hour, and it got up to 54 kilometres an hour at 2 o'clock. So the conditions were pretty terrible. It was classified catastrophic. The one thing to notice in this column, in the second last column though, over here, wind direction. So there was about a 90-degree wind shift at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And as the people who fight fires know, the wind shift, the head of the fire can be quite narrow and the flank of the fire can be quite long. And when the wind changes 90 degrees, the flank of the fire becomes a very fierce head of the fire. And that's what killed a lot of people. So the fire behaviour on the day, there were a lot of fires already alight in 1967. That 6 o'clock in the morning, 43% humidity, no wind, 20 or 20 degrees. It was just a warm summer day. People didn't have the detailed forecasts they get today. You didn't have apps on your phone. You didn't, people relied on watching the 7 o'clock news to work out what happened the day before, or not even watching it, listening to it in some cases. But 89 of the 110 fires of that day were already burning at the morning of 7th of February. Many of them were burning in bushland, and there's a reason for that we'll go into in a minute. But as the fires came out of bushland, a lot of bark is carried as embers, and that bark creates spot fires. And the fire moves very rapidly when it comes out of the bush into grassland. And the very strong winds created fingers of fire that sort of blow, and the fire runs very quickly, especially coming into paddocks and stubble and so on, which is in the district. Richmond was a lot drier than it is today, and no irrigation at that time. Problem came late in the afternoon when the wind changed, and the timing, as I mentioned before, was critical, with catastrophic in some situations and beneficial in other situations as the wind shifted in the mid-afternoon. So 7th of February, I've been talking about it a lot, Tasmania's worst recorded fire. 653,000 acres burnt that day, 264,000 hectares. So that's a lot. 264,000 hectares. Of that, 226,500 hectares burnt in 5 hours. And at the peak of the fire, 2 to 3 p.m, there was 184,000 acres burnt in an hour. So just put that in, just think about how big your property is, and 184,000 acres was burnt in the last hour at 3 o'clock on 7th of February 1967. So the fire was moving very quickly during that day, and that's what led to the loss of life. The Colebrook-Richmond fire was the biggest individual fire of the day. Of the 110 fires, the Colebrook fire was 37,800 acres. 37,800 acres was the Colebrook-Richmond fire. There were 20 fires larger than 10,000 acres. So Hermitage just went on the market, it's 11,000 acres. People were advertising it as a huge, huge property, and there were 20 fires bigger than that property on that day. 62 people died, or some of the details show 64. 53 directly from the fire and 9 indirectly from heart attacks or heat exhaustion while fighting the fire. 8 died in the Richmond Campania area. So I mentioned before that a lot of fires were burning. Of the 110 fires, 89 were burning on the morning of the catastrophic day. So 43 were deliberately planned burning off. 28 were suspected to be burning off. Children were suspected of lighting 4, and deliberate incendiarism 3. So it wasn't a great deal of arson involved. It was much more, people had just had fires going, and fires were part of farming at the time in a very almost casual manner, where you light a fire and let it burn. So those 89 fires, a lot were just people burning off to get rid of overgrowth, so you get a bit of green pick coming into winter. And a lot of them were not thought of. People didn't light them with malice. They were lit with a good intent, but things can go wrong on catastrophic days. Of the other 21 fires, a lot of them were put down to spot fires, eight spot fires that caused serious problems. And the spotting occurred, it was generally a mile was considered the spotting on the day. In some cases, it's been recorded up to 18 miles, but the fire made it to Bruny Island from Snug, so just an indication of how far. spotting occurs. As mentioned, the number of people killed in the fire, and I'm not talking just about Richmond here, I'm talking just generally about a day, to give people a prompt. It's a wake-up call, it's a memory, it's a bit of trauma. It certainly was I'm mentioning now 62, this is statistics, but it's actually 62 people were killed on the day. And the average age was 61. So what it showed was about more people died sort of in the urban areas than in the bush. Of those who died in the bush or in the open, 2 were caught in a canvas-topped Land Rover, 2 were mustering stock, 11 were firefighting. They weren't firefighters as we know them today. They weren't necessarily trained firefighters. They were people who were fighting the fire. And they might have been using a wet bag or a gum bow. They might have been, on the back of a tractor with a plough. I know that person that I knew here in Richmond, Merv Den, was burnt pretty badly, just on his forearms and his neck and his face, just trying to save his tractor. And that was right next to the Catholic Church. And his house was burnt down on that day. So the people who died in the urban areas, 17 died inside the house, 10 died within a few metres of the house, and 11 died some distance from the house. And what was found, that people who fled at the last moment and died, 50% of the houses they were fleeing from didn't catch fire. So that was, interesting fact. The guys killed who were chasing sheep, and the guys fighting the fires, may have survived if they'd taken what the government or the forestry or the person who wrote this report said. They didn't need to die because if they'd realised how bad the fire was, they would have got out of the way earlier. But on that particular day, because the wind was so strong, the pace of the fire was so fast that people were caught out, and then the wind shift. The wind shift in Hobart was 90 to 100 degrees, which is a full right angle. The wind shift at Hobart Airport was 45 degrees. I don't know what it was in detail in Richmond and Coal Valley, but let's assume it's a bit more like the airport than it is like Hobart. But still, a 45-degree wind shift is still significant if there's a long flank of a fire. I'm losing my way here a bit. This is a bit hard to read, but I've taken it out of the 1968 Tasmanian yearbook. So I became very interested in this fire just by chance, really. A few thin threads that sort of got me interested in it, but just the scale of it, and it's pretty hard to read, but you can sort of see the Coalbrook fire started near Melton Mowbray. It was rumoured to be guys boiling a billy after shooting on the Sunday. So, that fire then went from Melton Mowbray, near the Midland Highway, through Coalbrook, burnt out Coalbrook, and finished up at Midway Point, Penna and Sorrel. So that was a fire that went over 45 kilometres of fire in one day. No helicopters, no mobile phones, no TAS GRN radio system. It was just go for it. And so a lot of people were fighting the fire on the day that didn't have training as firefighters. But if you read the stories in the 50-year anniversary of the fire in 2017, there's a lot of stories in the Mercury. I didn't try and regurgitate those, but people were talking about running ploughs backwards and forwards around the house, and their sheds are burning down, they saved the house, or the sheep were burning and they saved the house or saved themselves, but lost thousands of head of stock burnt. That was one of the memories that I've got most. Was my mother was a school teacher at Sorrel Area School, and the next day Dad drove Mum to school and then drove us to town because everything was a bit of chaos, and I don't think there was any buses or just school was shut, I think, where I was at St Virgil's, and it was in West Hobart, and everything was sort of a bit terrible. So I think I went across Brinktop and out to Sorell, and just seeing hundreds of sheep pushed up in the corner of a paddock and burnt. It was terrible. So this is another picture of the same thing, really, just a little bit more modern map, but just showing the perimeter of the fire. This is also showing ignition points. So there wasn't a lot of ignition points in the Richmond fire, only 3, and that still turned into 40,000 acres. Municipal precautions. It was councils for themselves in 1967. The Rural Fires Board wasn't as organised as the TFS is today. So you won't be able to read this, but right down the very bottom, in the second last line, Richmond's got a fire truck with a 1,000-gallon tank, and it was one of the very few municipalities that did have a fire truck. Glenorchy had a fire truck. There's a few other trucks with 44-gallon drums on the back of them. That was sort of a standard way of fighting a fire, was run around with a few 44-gallon drums full of water and wet bags in them. But Richmond, if I can read it up here, I'll say, Rural Brigade at Richmond with truck and a 1,000-gallon tank and a fire hydrant and hose and campaigner. That was the facilities we had. So Richmond was caught up in this is a lot of detail, and this is showing 1,250 houses burnt. It's actually showing 1,072 houses, 249 shacks or cottages. So right down the bottom there you can see Richmond municipality this is. Richmond, 18 houses, 3 cottages, innumerable farm buildings, and 3 retail establishments, and the retail establishments were likely to service stations. Sorell lost 2 factories, which were sawmills, and Sorell lost 35 houses and 12 shacks, and Brighton 31 houses and 5 cottages and so on. So 1,250, 1,300 houses lost on the day. So Richmond, two houses actually lost in Richmond. One over near the Catholic Church, as I mentioned, and one in Paramore Street. So there were people killed nearby, people killed at Penna, people killed Campania, Richmond area. And I was 12-year-old and I didn't probably focus on that. I can't name names, but I've got a list of names of people who died if people want to look it up. But people pretty much know their own history in that regard. Richmond did have a volunteer brigade in 1967. It had been formed after Bill Casamatti had been in Victoria studying turf and before he started Strathair, and Bill had come back, and then Bill bought a truck and then convinced Richmond Council to buy it from him. And ironically, Bill was not here on the bushfire day. He was overseas. So he had the foresight to procure the truck, but then he didn't get to use it with the same opportunity because he was away studying. So one of the things I do recall personally, after our house fire at Dolcott, we were living in a cottage at Carrington for a couple of years while Dad rebuilt the house. And just below Carrington was the stock car track, and I remember the fire coming from Richmond up through the stock car track and burning up to Carrington on the Sunday before, 2 days before the bushfire. So that was quite interesting. It was a little bit of a busy afternoon up at Bowen's place, and we were running around trying to, manage the fire in the yard near the house, and it was very good on the Tuesday because there was lots of burnt ground to park things on. And that fire, no doubt, fortuitously protected the western side of the river at Richmond, because there was pretty significant fire break coming in from the north. And so if you look at the pattern of the fire, ran down on the other side of the river and down past the Catholic Church on that side. I don't have a lot of photos. I've got no photos. 12-year-old kid. We didn't run around with mobile phones in those days, so there's not a lot of photos from me. There's no doubt there are a few other photos around. I've just got pictures in my head of burnt sheep and chimneys standing. What else? Oh yeah, this is more or less a picture of the Blitz. This is Lou Holbrook and the Blitz. The 1942 Blitz that was bought for £400 in 1964, and that's a picture of Bill and Doug Chipman and Mike Brown when they discovered that Lou had the fire truck. So that's what it looks like now. So the fire truck might be in the parade, Noel, if Frank Howe's got some brakes on it by now. It was in my shed for about 3 years, and this is a bit of a thin thread. Our house burned down in 1965, and I, as Alan mentioned, worked in the mainland, worked overseas, and I still had a strong association with Richmond because my parents lived in the same house that they built in 1968 through until they both died. And then we bought our place up in Malcolm's Hut Road in 1992. So there was a 16-year gap from 1976 when I went to Melbourne University through to 1992 when I bought my house in Malcolm's Hut Road. They're the 16 years I didn't live at Richmond in a way. But coming back to Richmond to live full-time when Parliament Square started in Hobart, 2011, and didn't start then, but that's when I came back. And then 2015, I'm just coming to the post office one morning, and the Bill Casmati and David Eakins are selling sausages, and they collared me, and then I got involved in the splits. So in 2015, through a few Coal River Products meetings and a few donations, and the Historical Society took over the Blitz because no one else owned it. Lou had sold it to Bill Casmati, who'd collected some money from various people. So the Blitz is a bit of a good story, and it's a pleasure to hear it running, thanks to the hard work of a number of people. And hopefully, as I say, it's got some brakes by 10th of December, and someone will get to drive it. I've driven it, and it was a bit scary with no brakes, but anyway, it's through the Blitz and my memory of our house fire and the Blitz coming to the house fire and then getting involved in the Blitz that I actually joined the Fire Brigade 5 years ago, so thanks to that. So Richmond's recent large fires, I'm probably not the expert on this. I probably have to give way to some of the other members of the Fire Brigade. But the ones that I can remember since I've had my place at Malcolm's Hut Road was a big fire on the 7th of February that came down through Bacteetry and ran up and through, across Grasstree Hill Road, across Richmond Road, burned all of Butchers Hill, all the way down to Pittwater. And that was coincidentally the 7th of February as well. And another fire I remember was the day, started the same day as the Dun Alley fire. So the day before, yeah, it was the 3rd or 4th of January. I'll put the 4th of January, but it might have been the 3rd. So yeah, it's the day before the Dun Alley fire, but they started at the same time, because I remember pulling up outside Puddle Duck, taking photos of 2 columns of smoke. And one was at Fawcett and one was at Bacteetry. I should have dug out the photo we had on the Richmond Facebook page for a while, but I took a photo from Malcolm's Hut Road of Longs Hill burning, and it was quite a significant fire, and Johnny Canibba, who's here, Chief of the Fire Brigade at the moment, and John was pretty active on that day. Many smaller fires. Fire Brigade's been very active recently, not just in recent years, but in recent weeks. And so our fire brigade today. John is our captain, man in the red shirt, red hat. John's been chief for several years now and has been in the fire brigade for many years. How many, John? 30? 32. He doesn't look old enough, but he's been in the fire brigade for 32 years. So I've been 5 years, so I'm not the expert in this. And look, you know, we go to all sorts of events. The middle picture is our truck on the left-hand side of that middle picture. That's at a house fire up in Grice's Road in Tea Tree, together with a lot of other brigades, because the way the fire brigade works these days, our area goes from Fingerpost Road and Anfield Lane through to Dalcott, out the old Richmond municipality, out along Back Tea Tree Road, top of Bringtop Hill. But because of the vineyard work and a lot of Richmond brigade members working in the district, Richmond can get a crew in the daytime, a volunteer crew in the daytime, when Campania or Orielton or Tea Tree or Cambridge can't. So we tend to go to a lot of fires these days and in a lot of areas. The other photo is last week at Coles Bay. So basically, you know, the fires, Richmond were on the Colebrook fire for 6 days, just recently. Then Coles Bay for another couple of days after that. So now I'm getting into the future. This is a map, Tasmania, from Fire Brigade website today, showing that we're 143 mil down in moisture. We're minus 150 mil from where we should be, and as you can see, the red area in the Coal Valley and the Derwent Valley are the driest parts of Tasmania. And this has mentioned a lot of the academic stuff. Is Tasmania drought doesn't all come at the same place, same time. So Tasmania's fuel loads are generally heavier than the mainland. So when the fires come, they come quite badly. And we've had a wet year last year and then a dry year this year and a very dry year. I mean, we have had, I don't know, I'm just over 200 mil of rain for the year. You know, that's showing up here because if we'd had 350 mil by now, we wouldn't have the soil dryness we've got at the moment. So this is about the end of my presentation. So it's not going to be a particularly good year because we are so dry. So do your bushfire plan and any questions? Thank you.